Hey guys, Alex here. I hope you've been going well, and today I have with me my 2020 Apple MacBook Air with Apple Silicon and the new M1 chip. I've had this for about a month or so I've been using it almost every day when I've needed to do everyday tasks on it, maybe even a bit of video editing, so I've had some great in-depth time with this machine. And I'm sure if you're looking at upgrading your next computer or your next Mac, you might be looking at this machine too. So let's dive in and let's see what's changed from previous generations and what makes this computer so great. Taking a look at the design of the 2020 Apple MacBook Air, it hasn't changed much, if at all really, from the previous version. We've still got the same design in terms of this is a space grey here, and it has the wedged shape from the thicker part here, tapering off to a thinner part here. We only have 2 Thunderbolt ports available, and that's the same across all of the M1 machines, including the MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini, and that just seems to be a design decision and a limitation with the M1 architecture that I'm sure will be improved on the higher models when they come to Apple Silicon. But otherwise, the actual physical size and weight of this machine is largely unchanged from the past. We do have a fanless design, however. The MacBook Air does have no fan, which I find is actually great. I kind of like having pure silence. That did sometimes ramp up in previous models. Now it is completely silent. The MacBook Pro does, however, still have a fan, and that just means this computer might thermal throttle a little bit more when you're under some really heavy workloads. But some people have performed tests and it doesn't seem to affect it too much, maybe 10-15% under some very heavy workloads. So moving on to the inside of the machine, we have the keyboard, which is non-butterfly. It's just the Magic Keyboard. So gone is that problematic keyboard that we had from the past that I had on my 2016 MacBook Pro. This machine with this keyboard is very easy and comfortable to type on. It has a lot of travel, and it's obviously, I think, going to be a lot more reliable long term, which is great to see. Now, for the display itself is 400 nits of brightness. Now, that is a little bit different to the 500 nits that you can get on the MacBook Pro, but personally, I think the display looks great. It's been pretty bright for me both inside and out, and unless you really are going to prefer having that extra brightness, for example, if you are working outside a little bit more often or you just want that brighter display, that's where the Pro might be a slight advantage for you. But comparing to the previous MacBook Air, this computer does now have wide color P3 compatibility, which matches the MacBook Pro. Previously, that was missing, so you didn't have that full color range that was available on the MacBook Pro. So it's really great to see that you no longer have to compromise on that if you choose the MacBook Air. Outside of that and moving on to the webcam, there hasn't really been a change from a sensor perspective. It's still the same FaceTime HD 720p that we are used to from previous models, which, look, it could be a little bit more. But what Apple has done, which they made note of in the Keynote, was that it now has a new image signal processor, which brings slightly better lighting and overall a better picture. And I've found using it on some video conferencing that it is a bit of an improvement, and to be honest, I don't really need those extra pixels. But other than that, the rest of the design of the machine and on the inside is much the same. But overall, I do like having that fanless design option in the MacBook Air. So moving on to performance, which is half the story, if not more, with these M1 MacBooks, this machine, in summary, has been mind-blowing. The performance from this machine in everyday use, alongside Geekbench scores and the like, has been incredible. Now, M1, to explain it briefly, is an ARM instruction set, very similar to what we find in iOS devices. Apple has moved to this from the previous Intel architecture, and it's a big change from what we previously had in the previous MacBook Air and the rest of the Mac lineup. Now, performance is a big part of this story, and that's what I've realized over the past month. When we even just open the machine, you can see just how quickly it resumes. It's very impressive how quickly that comes on, and that's because the computer has quick resume built into it, just like your phone when you want to resume it quickly. So that's something really impressive to see. But more generally, I want to talk about the experience I've had with the performance over the past 30 days or so. Now, this is a blank account, but I just want to show you here. because this is pretty indicative of the experience as a whole. When you start launching many applications at once, you can just see how fast this computer is and how much it keeps up to speed. Now, the reason I'm here on my desk is I also use this 4K monitor up here in the video, which is an LG 4K 27-inch monitor. Now, with my previous 2016 MacBook Pro and with the Lenovo Windows computer that I use every day for work, they're sometimes a little bit janky on integrated graphics. They'll flicker a bit, applications will take a while to adjust to the right resolution, but here on this Mac, very similar to my iOS devices, the graphics just flies, even driving 4K pixels on this display. So for me, performance has been absolutely phenomenal. Now, a big part of that performance is also compatibility, because there's a number of different applications that you will look to run on the M1 given the changed architecture. Because it is no longer an Intel architecture, Apple has built something called Rosetta 2, which is the new version of Rosetta that was available from the last PowerPC to Intel transition. Now, why that is important is because of the way Apple has done it. They have built it in a way that essentially recompiles Intel-based applications to recompile on their first loading on this machine. So when you first install an Intel application and you first launch it, it takes a few seconds to launch for the first time, and then it's recompiled. Now, what that means is that the applications, they're not emulated. And so what I've experienced when running some applications that are definitely still Intel-based is I've still experienced generally better performance, which is really, really impressive. That compares to, example, what Microsoft is doing with Windows 10 on ARM, where they are emulating x86, 32-bit, and now 64-bit applications. So they suffer a bit with performance, but I haven't really had many issues, and I generally tend to find that those non-optimized applications are actually working better. For the applications that are optimized, they are working like no tomorrow. Using Safari, for example, is fantastic on both battery life and having many, many tabs open. It is noticeably smoother and easier to have more tabs open than any other machine I have ever used before. And there are many applications that are starting to get optimized that will be optimized as they go and as developers update their applications. Talking a little bit further about compatibility and some of the downsides, there are going to be some things that you are going to miss out on. It's not at all a perfect story, as much as Apple have tried to say it is so, but it has been pretty good. Some of the obvious downsides that we need to look at is, for example, there's no more boot camp. You're not going to be able to run full x86 Windows 10 on a different partition on your Mac. Similarly, you're not going to be able to run Windows 10 on Parallels, or at least the traditional version. However, Parallels have recently released a new technical preview that will run the Windows 10 ARM version. But just like I said before about Windows 10 on ARM using emulation and the likes, there's some of the considerations that you're going to have if you buy this machine. So if you're a big Windows user and you want to have it running on your Mac, just keep that in mind that it might not be too fantastic. Similarly, I do use Google Drive. Now, I use Google Drive File Stream, and at the moment, that's one of those apps that just aren't working as yet. I don't quite have this right, I'm sure, but it uses an implementation of Kext files that existed in previous versions of Mac that are no longer compatible on the M1 machines. So what that does mean for me is I can't run Google Drive File Stream. But I'm sure being such a popular application, especially in enterprise and business presence, that will hopefully be updated pretty soon. And I think that's pretty indicative for a lot of the applications that you're likely to run on this MacBook Air. Something that is also important to discuss about these M1 Macs is because they are now running Apple Silicon, which has always been present in iOS devices, these Macs can now also run iOS apps, like iPhone and iPad apps. So searching here for Among Us, we're able to access the Among Us app that's designed for iPad. So if you have a particular use case where, let's say, you want to access some games or some apps that are available on iPad that you haven't really got an alternative for here on macOS, you can now run those. And they do run very smoothly. But something to note is I personally haven't used it all that much. And the reasoning for that comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, most of these apps are touch-sensitive applications. They are designed for a touch interface, and they're a little bit awkward to use sometimes with a mouse. Among Us is a good example of a simple game that's not too bad to use with a mouse, but there are plenty of apps that are probably just going to be better on that iPad. But if you have got a game or an application that you do want to run from iOS on your Mac, you can now do that on M1. So we wouldn't really be able to compare different computers without probably running a Geekbench test, especially because the M1 Mac seems to be coming down a lot to performance. So let's run this test now and check out how it performs. So there we are. We've got the single core score and the multi-core score on Geekbench 5. Now, these are some pretty impressive numbers and are honestly quite reflective of the experience I've had with the machine. This level of performance is definitely smashing the previous MacBook Air out of the park and even the previous MacBook Pros in the 13-inch form. So let's have a look at some benchmark charts just to compare where it's all at. When we compare here, this exactly drills down the experience and what we're seeing on the scores. We can see on the single core scores that the top of the single core scores are the Mac Mini, MacBook Pro, and MacBook Air, all with the same 3.2 GHz, 8 cores on Apple M1. They are very highly scored, and that is outperforming the MacBook Pro 13-inch with 4 cores on Core i7, an iMac 27-inch Retina early 2019 with 3.6 GHz Core i9 and 8 cores, and the list goes on. So very impressive scores from a single core performance. Now when we talk about multi-core, sure, it's not quite as high as some of those Mac Pros, but when we bring it down here and take a look, we've got the Mac Mini, MacBook Pro, and MacBook Air all scoring very similarly and scoring very well, outperforming plenty of 16-inch Core i9 MacBook Pros, for example, with 8 cores. So that is showing the pure performance of M1 and how well Apple has optimized that chip to run on these computers. To be honest, the performance on these overall, as I mentioned before, using the machine starts to fade away. You start to not be concerned about how long something might take to load, and you just start to breeze through the activity that you're trying to perform on the machine, which is really, I imagine, the ultimate goal of computing. Speaking about performance, compatibility, the obvious other part for the rest of this review is considering the MacBook Air's battery life. That's always been an important part of the MacBook Air as an entry-level computer and as an ultra-portable. So how's the battery performance? Well, I'm going to jump into it now, but more so I'm going to speak to my experience that I've had with this machine. The battery life, and I know I'm saying a lot of these words a lot, but the battery life has been phenomenal, unlike anything I've seen on a computer before. When I first unboxed this computer and opened it up, I thought there was a problem with the battery percentage meter because it wouldn't leave under 90% for a long time. There are periods where I can close this computer, open it, use it casually over a couple of days, and it still has battery life. It has been that impressive, and it comes down to that efficiency and that optimization. The other thing that I've found with it is that it doesn't really seem to discriminate both based on workload and activity. So even when I've been opening a lot of apps or running a lot of tabs, and I've closed the computer and resumed it and continued using all of those tabs, the performance stays there, and so does the battery life. It's not too dissimilar to if I was running a single tab. So it has been very impressive. And Apple on this is offering up to about 15 hours of wireless web time and has been offering about 18 hours of Apple TV use. Now, compare that to the MacBook Pro, which now actually has more battery life, about 20 hours of wireless web use. That's something to consider as well, as you will get a little bit more battery out of the MacBook Pro. But if you're choosing the Air, I think you're going to be really happy with the battery life. So in summary, now that I've had this Mac for about a month, what are my overall thoughts, and is it something you should buy? I think you should absolutely consider buying this computer. I think there probably isn't a better everyday laptop that has fantastic performance, excellent battery life, and a fanless design that is slim and light with a great quality display, a good keyboard finally, all in still a pretty decent design. I think that all of my applications are mostly working really quite well, and that transition has not been too difficult. And as long as your use cases don't require applications that aren't yet compatible or doesn't require the x86 version of Windows 10 that you might want to run in Parallels or on Boot Camp, both of which you can't do on this machine. If you would just want to use this computer as an everyday machine, whether it's a bit of higher workloads or just everyday use, this is fantastic. I would definitely recommend considering buying this computer. Thanks for watching this review. If you've enjoyed it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if you're looking at this computer or if you've already bought it. And I'll catch you in the next video.